Hey, thank you everyone for coming. I'm excited to see my colleagues and friends and so many of you community members here today. I want to thank you for joining the Center for Cultural Landscapes event, I Didn't Come Here to Stay, a gallery talk sponsored by both our School of Architecture, our Brown Initiative, and of course, the Mellon-supported Outsider Preservation Initiative. We're excited to host artist Letitia Huckaby and Johnica Rivers, whose work aligns with the intervention that the Outsider Preservation Initiative aims to make discursively and among professionally trained preservation practitioners on the significance of expressive arts, bodily practices, and material culture in Black landscape commemoration. So the Outsider Preservation Initiative is a 3-year Center for Cultural Landscapes initiative that celebrates preservation practice occurring at the margins of the field. And what we do is center descendant-led preservation of historic Black settlements founded after emancipation. So to learn more about our programming, the other exciting things that the center does and about the Outsider Preservation Initiative, please be sure to email us at cclevents@virginia.edu. Now more about our guests. Letitia Huckaby will discuss the manner in which she interprets these places, that is historic Black places, through textiles and portraiture. We've also been pleased to sponsor research visits for Letitia as she explores landscapes of slavery and landscapes of freedom in Central Virginia over the past several months. Letitia Huckaby holds a degree in journalism from the University of Oklahoma, a BFA from Lesley University, and master's degree from University of North Texas, Denton. Huckaby is exhibited as an emerging artist at Phillips, New York, the Tyler Museum of Art, the Studio School of Harlem, Renaissance Fine Art in Harlem, curated by Deborah Willis, the McKenna Museum in New Orleans, the Camden Palace Hotel in Cork City, Ireland, and the Texas Biennial at Blue Star Contemporary Art Museum. Her work is included in several prestigious collections, and I'm not even going to cover them all. These are just a few. The Library of Congress, Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia, the Samela Lewis Contemporary Art Collection at Scripps College in Claremont, California. And Ms. Huckaby is represented by Tally Dunn Gallery in Dallas. And Ms. Huckaby is also the co-founder of Kinfolk House, a collaborative project space that inhabits a 100-year-old historic home where community and art converge in the predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood of Polytechnic in Fort Worth, Texas. And she's also was named Texas Artist of the Year in 2022. So we're pleased to enjoy the talk with also, and I don't mean to say also as is second, but in addition, we have Johnica Rivers, a peripatetic curator and writer rooted in Texas, who lives and works between New York and North Carolina. She is curator at large on the land and the North Carolina Historic Sites Initiative, through which she curates site-responsive installations, proposes commissions and acquisitions, and advises on special projects. And her recent exhibition projects include, which I was excited to get to witness, a sojourn for Harriet Jacobs and Letitia Huckaby Memorable Proof. She's co-editor alongside Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Michelle Lanier. Michelle Lanier is one of our Outsider Preservation Initiative advisors of the sojourning volume of Southern Cultures published by UNC Press for the Center for the Study of the American South. So we're excited to welcome these luminaries. And with that, I hand it over to both Letitia and Johnica. And after the talk, we'll have time for some dialogue, and in the East Gallery, we'll be able to view the work. And at that time, we invite you to enjoy refreshments. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I feel very lucky to be here with my friend and my, now I can say long-term collaborator, Letitia Huckaby. And Letitia, I want to start by just talking a little bit about your trajectory, starting out in photojournalism and how you made your way to the documentary arts and specifically documenting descendants in places.
Sure, but before we jump into it, I want to take this moment to thank everyone who was involved with the work being installed here. I'd like to, and I'm going to forget some names, I'm sure, but Dr. Roberts for giving me this opportunity, for Justice and Joyce and Ashley and Kyle. There was a lot of hands that went into putting all this together. And I've forgotten somebody, I'm sure, but thank you to everyone for this opportunity. To answer Johnica's question, I did start as a documentary photographer. I thought that I was going to shoot for Magnum and go to war-torn countries and tell those stories. Then I got married and had 3 kids, and things kind of shifted. And after our first child, I went to grad school. But before I went to grad school, I lost my father, and I'd never lost anybody who was close to me before, so it had a huge sort of impact. He was from Greenwood, Mississippi, and he was an Army officer. And I grew up a little bit a spoiled Army brat that didn't really have to deal with some of the issues that most African Americans face today, because he was second command in the base, so nobody was gonna mess with me. But after he passed, I started looking at things a little bit differently. And the town he grew up in was surrounded, his grandmother's neighborhood was surrounded on 3 sides by cotton fields. And Greenwood is an interesting place in that if you go there today, you almost feel like you've been catapulted back in time. Because on one side of the river, there's a large discrepancy in the quality of life. So on the south side of the river is predominantly Black people, abandoned buildings, some old slave quarters that people are still living in that don't have water or electricity. And on the opposite side of the river, brick homes with large land and landscaping. So I started looking at those things right before I went to grad school. And I had this desire to turn the camera on myself and stop telling other people's stories, but tell these stories about my family, my culture, ancestry. So I really started digging into cotton as a symbol for African American history, almost photographing it as if it was a rose, putting it in my work, and ultimately that led to me printing on it. And from that day to this, I've incorporated cotton fabric into my work. So I consider myself still a documentary photographer. Maybe doesn't look like the work probably looks closer to painting than it does to photography, because I create these individual pieces. But truth is such an important part of what I do. I want to document things exactly the way they are. And I think that that's where I still feel the connection to a documentary aesthetic.
Oh, there we go. So we're gonna get into Welcome. And there is some work from Welcome featured in the gallery. And this is a installation shot of the piece that you see in the gallery as it was first presented. And this is what I like to call the chapel room in Kinfolk House. And if you are ever able to visit Fort Worth, Texas, which is my hometown, which is how I met Letitia.
Yeah.
I'm a 4th generation Fort Worthian and an 8th generation Texan. You have to visit Kinfolk House. And I want you to talk about Kinfolk House as a personal space to you, as you talked about turning the camera on yourself. Kinfolk House as a physical space of personal history, but also as a social sculpture. And then the work that we're seeing here, these photographs that were featured in Welcome.
So Kinfolk House is actually my husband's grandmother's house. And it was built in, I believe, the 1920s. And when she passed, and my husband's a painter, a house full of artists whose children don't want to have anything to do with art. When she passed, we bought the house from his mother and her siblings. House was being lived in by some of the uncles. They weren't taking very good care of the house. So the city was threatening to tear it down. So we bought the house and spent years fixing it up. We gutted out all of the sheetrock and found, it's called shiplap. It was like all boxed in ceilings and walls, and the ceilings actually had been dropped at some point, so we added almost 2 feet of ceiling height. We started demolishing the inside of it. And it sits on almost 2 acres of land just southeast of downtown Fort Worth in a predominantly Black and brown community. So the idea was, my husband went to Yale for his MFA. And as part of his final review, he asked his professors, can art have an impact on regular people? Because most of the artists coming out of Yale, the work that they're producing, average Americans are not going to see that work because it's going to be in museums, it's going to be in high-end galleries, it's going to be all over the world, and it's for a select group. He didn't get a good answer to that question, so he wanted Kinfolk House to be the answer to that question. So the idea is that we would, as artists that have done a little bit in the art world, draw big names to this working class neighborhood, and also at the same time influence the neighborhood itself. Hopefully they would take ownership of Kinfolk House as their art space. So we host 3 or 4 projects a year where we bring in a local artist, a regional artist, and a national artist to collaborate on a project, and to also hold some sort of programming for the community. And through that, over the last 3 years, we've been able to collaborate with museums in the area. We had the Fort Worth Opera come and sing in the backyard. We've had cookouts and food trucks. So it's a real widespread of the kind of events that we have there. But for the first project, Cedric and I, that's my husband, decided to exhibit first as a draw, because we knew our names would get the press that we wanted for the space as it's opening. And so the work that you guys have on display is actually the first piece, if you're reading the wall left to right, is one of my pieces from that exhibition called Welcome, which Welcome was my husband's grandmother's maiden name. When she was married, her name was Carpenter. At birth, her name was Welcome. And so we really saw the first exhibition as a collaboration with her. We hung some of her church hats in the house. We had some quilts up. We had some little tchotchkes that he collected from the aunts or his grandmothers. We had Cedric's paintings, and we had my works on fabric. The project I did was documenting the landscape between South Texas and Fort Worth. Cedric's grandmother was from a town called Weimar, Texas, that's outside of Houston. And she moved to Fort Worth when she was approximately 14 years of age and never went back. So none of the children or grandchildren ever got to experience that space. So I thought I would bring that experience to them. So I drove to South Texas and sort of documented the landscape between 2 locations. Those images were printed onto cotton fabric. Some of them, like the one you have, are framed in embroidery hoops, very large, oversized embroidery hoops. And the other images were quilted. So they were cut up and quilted, and quilt tops sewn onto the back of them. As a kind of reference to home and family, those are the things, the quilts, things that your grandmother created with an embroidery hoop. Those are the things that get passed down right? We don't use those to wash or clean with, they're precious. And so I wanted to frame those landscapes in that way, connected to family and home.
Welcome is actually one of my favorite bodies of work that you've done. I think we all know the Great Migration, right? It gets a lot of voice on the mic. But I love the idea of one matrilineal migration. So the way in which Black women or mothers move, but also moving within your home state, right? And I think there's something to the power of those of us that stayed, and we don't hear enough of those stories. I also want you to talk about the interior of the space, because I also view Kinfolk House as an act of historic preservation, right? And you can kind of see, I wish I had put a different photo, but the edge of a pew right here. So this room, the seating, instead of, if you've all been to museums, you typically have, gallery benches, a very almost Shaker style of furniture. At Kinfolk House, there are church pews. And they're not just any church pews. Can you talk about some of the objects outside of the art that are in the space that is sort of an act of historic preservation?
So that space that you see on the screen there is was originally 3 small rooms. You know how in older houses, there was a lot of little small rooms all pieced together. And in that particular area, the roof had caved in. I think there was a raccoon living back there. It was pretty bad. So we ended up having to completely gut it and redo that space. So we made it a little bit wider and it looks totally different. When you walk into, than the rest of the house. When you walk into Kinfolk House, you walk into these large wooden planks. Everything boxed in, it's warm. You can see the structure of the ceiling. There's pin floors in the bathroom and an old clawfoot tub. It has a like history built into it. And as you're weaving through the space, this is the last space that people come into, and it's this complete shift. And it also has double doors, which they're right on the other side of that piano, that look out to the backyard, which, as I mentioned, is about 1.5 acres. Our neighbors have goats, chickens, and horses. So it's a really unique experience within the city footprint. The pews actually came from our church. The church that our family goes to was getting rid of all of their old pews and they were just gonna throw them away. So we collected them and put them in the space. They're not always in the space, but it was important to Cedric and I that they were there for this first project. And there's also in the back of that room, these confessional doors that we found at an old home supply and used the stained glass design for the logo for Kinfolk House. So it has a spiritual weight to that space and then kind of glows when you come into it. So it's an interesting shift. You're just what architecture does.
This slide also features work that is in the gallery that you'll be able to view today. So this is from And Thy Neighbor, which was part of your art space residency in San Antonio, correct?
Correct.
Yes, I think our mics are bouncing off of each other. I'll move mine to the left. And this gets into, so we just looked at some landscapes from Welcome. Letitia has a very signature, one of your signatures, silhouette style of portraiture. And so can you talk about And Thy Neighbor, the Art Space San Antonio residency, and this particular piece and the relationship between these two subjects?
So this body of work was created when I was in residence at Art Place in San Antonio, and this a residency that we based a lot off of with Kinfolk House. Because in this residency, they'll bring in a state artist, a national artist, and an international artist for a 6-week residency. They give the artist a place to stay. They give them a stipend to create their work. They give them assistance, have their own studio space. It's a really sweet deal. When I did it, it was in COVID. So, during COVID, it was a little bit of a different experience for me than most of the artists. But I was still able to, make work and have a wonderful experience. So I did this project called Anti-Neighbor, and if you think back to 2020, I know a lot has happened since then, but 2020 was crazy. With the pandemic, with the protests in response to police violence, and also with everything that was happening with immigration. There were babies being kept in cages on the border in Texas with these Mylar blankets to sleep under. It was a lot happening in 2020. So I wanted to make this project called Anti-Neighbor that looked at immigrants and refugees of African descent. A lot of times when we think about immigration, our mind goes to one population, but there's a lot of cultures that are immigrating to this country, and it's not great for anybody to experience. So all the people that I photographed were immigrants and refugees. And I think the silhouette worked great because there were many of them that did not want to show their faces. In particular, this pair, Stephanie and Gloria, who are a mother and her child. She was not interested in the child being photographed if her face was going to show. So once she realized that I was going to photograph them in silhouette, she was like, oh, she can take a picture too. And also on the piece, you'll be able to see this when you go back into the gallery space. There's embroidered into the shadows at the very bottom of them. It doesn't show in the image, but you'll see it on the piece. Their descriptions of their ethnicity. So I believe they're Cameroonian American, and I made it intentionally subtle. The thread is the same color as the silhouette. So you can't see it from far away. You have to get close to the piece in order to read it, which is my subtle way of saying you have to really get close to someone in order to know something about them. You can't just look at them from across the room and make your judgments. So that was my way of drawing the viewer in closer to those individuals, because we're sort of trained when we look at art, if it's a certain size, to stand a certain distance back, right? And give it space. So I wanted to draw the viewer in for this project, which is based off of scripture and our neighbor, and the idea that we're supposed to love God, we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. There were 12 pieces. A number I like because of the connection to the Bible and disciples, but including 3 of those were diptychs like a pair here. There's 4 in the exhibition. Those 2 are actually one piece in my mind, and the other 2 are individual pieces.
Here we have another, it is both a landscape shot, but we're also looking at an image of something that once was, but is not quite whole anymore. We talk a lot about absences and silences in the archives, so things that are missing, addresses where a house maybe once stood. We call those the footprint of. And you have a very interesting way of documenting what once was, what is sometimes not there at all anymore, or what someone may be walked by. Can you talk about this?
So this project, Beautiful Blackness, was the beginnings of my focus on landscape. As a documentary photographer, you're sort of trained that there's certain things that are not considered serious work. Women are supposed to make work about their kids. Landscape is not serious art. And I have always been obsessed with the landscape. There's a history to the land, and something about walking that land that you know hundreds of years ago, somebody else walked that land, very powerful to me. And I feel like the land holds such memory and culture and strength, just all that's good about humanity. I see it reflected in the landscape. So I was doing this project, and I had convinced myself I'm gonna do a landscape project. I don't care what anybody else thinks, the critics, and go to blah, 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 blah. And I decided to follow the path of the exodusters, which was a term given to African Americans that migrated out of the South into the Dust Bowl. And so I stayed in Kansas for a while. I did some work in Texas and in Louisiana, Mississippi for this project. But this image is in Kansas, near a freedmen's town called Nicodemus. And I was following these Black towns, because in Kansas, they had recruited Black communities to come to Kansas to build their towns. And they told them, oh, there's lots of trees. I don't know if y'all have been to Kansas before, but there's not lots of trees. But they told them there's lots of trees, you can build your houses, you can build this. But when they got there, there wasn't a lot of trees. And so they ended up making homes like this that you see. This is one of the last ones that's left, where they dug actually into the ground and created these spaces to live until they could collect enough timber to build a structure. The only reason this one is left is because it's halfway between Nicodemus and I believe the town was called Stockton, which was a sundown town, where if you were a Black person, you had to be out before sundown, or it could be big trouble for you. So they built this space halfway between, so that when the men went into town to get supplies, they couldn't make it back all the way to Nicodemus. They had a place to stay and sleep for the night, and then make the journey the rest of the way. And it's on private land, so it's been left preserved. So I was able to take that photograph, that space.
Here we have another silhouette and then both landscape and structure.
So these images are part of all of the small hoops that are on the wall in the back are part of this beautiful Blackness project, where I was trying to show Blackness in the landscape, whether that was through the location where I was taking pictures, or a kind of aesthetic Blackness in the landscape. So in Kansas, they do a lot of controlled burnings. So I photographed a lot of that Black catfish in the water, and you could see really clearly in the water. And then Black figures as sort of a poetic representation of the individuals who would have inhabited those spaces. This house that you're looking at there is from a town in southern Louisiana. It's called Morrison. I believe I'm saying it right. It'll come to me after I'm finished with this. But this particular town, they actually received their 40 acres in a mule. And a lot of the descendants still live in that area. I say that in quotation marks around still, because at the time that I was documenting, it was slowly becoming less and less inhabited. There is a tendency with Black towns to run a highway through the middle of it, and also to build manufacturing plants right on the edges of it. And that's what happened with this particular town. And so a lot of the residents were coming down with high levels of cancer and all these illnesses. And so they were trying to get out. So they would sell their land, but the companies that surrounded them had a very particular deal for them. They were going to sell their land. They had to sell all of it at one time. They couldn't just sell part of their land. So they were buying up 40-acre plots of land from these families left and right. So I photographed that, and some of the images were like no trespassing signs, but what you saw behind the no trespassing sign was like the paths for where the house used to be, and some rose bushes that were still growing on either side of it, which to me was very powerful imagery. So that's what that one is.
So I want to get into your process. So this is a shot of Letitia, and we're gonna touch on some of her more recent projects to bring you up to date into how the practice has evolved. So this is a shot of Letitia in Edenton, North Carolina, photographing a subject for what then becomes the silhouettes that you see. So if you're wondering, how does that happen? So Letitia, I would love for you to talk about your quote unquote studio practice, but your studio is really in situ in place.
Right.
But also the process of actually how you develop relationships with your subjects, how you develop relationships with communities, how you develop relationships with longstanding organizations that are already rooted into the community, so that your subjects actually feel safe, and how you sort of ground yourself in a documentary ethic into how you enter a space and engage with communities. And you're not a drop-in, drop-out artist. You have long-term commitments, personal relationships that you develop over time.
Yeah, I think the documentary and not to be big-headed, maybe my character plays into that, but I really feel like the way to best tell a story is to live amongst it for a little bit. And I started that even before I was shooting in this way of printing on fabric. When I was an undergrad in Boston, my first project was at this jazz cafe called Wally's. And Wally's started during the Chitlin circuit and has live music 365 days a year. And at the time I was in school, it was being run by Wally's daughter, and I would go during the day and just hang out. And sometimes I might take one picture, sometimes I wouldn't take any pictures. It was important to me to just have a conversation, because that really fuels what you see when you look at the work. You just run through a space, snap a picture, and keep going. It doesn't have any life. I think painters say it's like painting from life, right? As opposed to painting from a photograph. There's something that's missing when that individual is not sitting right there in front of you, looking you in the eye. You can see the warmth from them and all of that. So I feel like with my work, it needs that time, it needs that attention. And I also feel a big responsibility to whoever I'm photographing, to represent them in a way that they would be proud of. How do you know anything about them if you haven't sat and had any conversation, got a sense of their character and thoughts and ideas? So all of that plays into the way that I work. And I don't have a traditional studio right now where I bring people into. I'm often going into other spaces. That's still stemming from a sort of documentary and training and upbringing and focus. The image that you see there that was taken in Edenton, those sheets are all like vintage bed sheets that I collect from thrift stores. I love Etsy, because you can just scroll through and pick what you want and it comes in the mail. But my mother grew up on a dairy farm in Louisiana, and the only thing they bought from the store was flour. And it came in these beautiful fabric pads with patterns. And her mother would take them, I'm sure some of you are aware of this, and make clothing or use them for quilts or do all these cool things with them. And I was really inspired by that. And I started working by printing onto vintage flour sacks. I found a guy who cleans out warehouses and had access to all these defective sacks that never got used. And I would print images directly on them. When I wanted to go bigger, they don't make flour sacks 6 feet high. So then I decided to get these patterns that sort of reminded me of the flour sacks and photograph the individuals behind those sheets. So when you look at the piece, it's really all one big photograph printed on some cotton white fabric.
I want to get into your most recent exhibited project, which is a living requiem. And I think it's important because we're on site at a university today. And this is a project that was born from a university's history. That university being TCU, Texas Christian University, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is a picture of a descendant of Charlie and Kate Thorpe, who were two enslaved persons that were integral to the founding of TCU, the sustainability of TCU, and specifically the care of the first undergraduates that studied there. And their history was essentially unknown, like so many others, until a graduate fellow at TCU saw a name in a newspaper. And you know how you see a name and then you just kind of can't let it go, like, wait, who's Charlie and Kate Thorpe and why are they mentioned? And they went down a rabbit hole and found the history. And then the descendants were contacted, and then TCU commissioned an artistic project to honor the descendants. So there were no, other than this one photograph, verifiable photographs of Charlie and Kate Thorpe. So this way of documenting descendants is also a way to fill in a gap in the archive. So can you talk about that project?
Yeah, so Texas Christian University has what they call a portrait project, where they've been hiring artists to create an artwork in honor of individuals that normally wouldn't be recognized by the university. So I think the first round they did was the first Black graduates from Texas Christian University, and it was an artist that did pencil drawings. And they stayed up for a couple of years, and they were planning to rotate out every 2 years. COVID hit, it ended up being 3 years, but then I was asked to create these two pieces in honor of Charlie and Kate Thorpe, that Johnica just mentioned, who were formerly enslaved couple that did everything but teach. They were the cook, they were the housekeeper, they were the nurse, they did the landscaping, they did everything but teach. And they actually, TCU started out in Thorpe Springs, Texas. Charlie and Kate Thorpe, as we all know, slaves were named after the slave owner, were brought with the institution to Fort Worth to continue to work with them. So all of their descendants still live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There are no pictures of Charlie and Kate Thorpe, so I didn't have that to work from. So I decided to photograph their descendants as poetic stand-ins for them. They are in their image as far as I'm concerned. So that's two individuals are actually cousins. I tried to find two that look like they could be about the same age. And the young man is actually graduating with TCU on a full ride in engineering. So they're making some things right. So because I photographed multiple people to try to pick the two I wanted to use for this project, I had all these other images for another body of work, which was the living requiem that showed at the Fort Worth Modern during an exhibition called Diaries of Home, where I was able to install them in this, almost like this space, really long hallway that kind of overlooks the water. And there was 15 pieces. And the designs were inspired by memorial brooches. One of those brooches back in the 1800s where they would take somebody's hair, put it in the center, that's DNA, right? So now we have DNA in the center of these pieces. The frames were cut with a CNC router into birch plywood, left unstained. Just the raw wood, so when you get close to the pieces, you can kind of see the levels where the wood was glued together. Made it feel special, nicer than just regular plywood, to see the design cut into them. So all of those were inspired by brooches. And then the wallpaper, actually Johnica helped me with the wallpaper, because while I was working on the Edenton project, I had the pleasure of touring a plantation that North Carolina had just acquired as a historical site. And I think that they had just gotten the keys like 3 days before.
No, it was, so this is Hayes Plantation, now known as Hayes Farm, was still up until 2023 owned by the original enslaver family, who could no longer keep up the farm. And it, through this very long, arduous process, through a public-private partnership, was acquired by the state of North Carolina and became a state historic site. And Letitia was there today, so you were the first visitor of it going from private to public property. And that also means nothing on the property had been assessed. So we were holding like first edition copies of books printed in 1772 and all kinds of things. And it was actually very unreal. And there was this beautiful, just random fabrics
Yeah.
folded up in the library. And there was a particular fabric that Letitia, it was a very cluttered, hadn't been cleaned in probably 100 years library, and her eye just went to a corner of a shelf and said, "What is that?" And we pulled it off.
It was so unreal, like, I have to paint this picture, it sits on the bay in Edenton. This house has 3 floors with balconies on both sides. A long drive with, big trees and a rose garden roundabout in front. It had 3 kitchens. The coach house still had 5 carriages in it of different time periods. It was like literally walking back through time. One kitchen was outside, one kitchen made it into the house, but it was still very mediocre, and then you had sort of traditional kitchen. It was very, very interesting. Like she said, we went in the beautiful rotunda style library with busts and paintings and all these old books. They had put a bunch of boxes in a room off the side, and there was this fabric that was stretched. I don't know if they used it to
We
hang on
think,
the wall
we
or.
think it was, now that we've done some assessing, a bed, that it had draped a bed frame, like that it had been a covering for,
Canopy.
yeah, for a bed
I
frame.
wondered about that, it was a canopy or, so it was a canopy, that makes sense, because it was on this structure. And so I asked if they would take a high resolution scan of it so that I could use something from a plantation in this project about these descendants of slaves, like reclaiming something, right? And as she said, they hadn't assessed anything of the house, and they were like, no, we don't know how to do that, we'll just send it to you. So they sent me this fabric FedEx. FedEx, I don't even send art FedEx, maybe UPS.
I FedEx you fabric from the 17th.
Right. So I was very nervous, took it immediately to get scanned and FedEx it directly back. But then we made a repeat of that pattern and just wallpapered the walls all the way down this long hallway. And it was so magical for me because it was a group exhibition, all female artists that deal with portraiture, had some Sally Mann in the show. And my room was kind of like the white space at Kinfolk House, where you kind of weave your way into it last. And there would be an audible gasp as people came around the corner and this wallpaper and these pieces. I thought, okay, I did something right. They're doing this gasp, but
Yeah, it was, if you go on the Tally Guns website, but also I think the Huckabee Studios website, you can see, this is also the first time I had seen, I don't know if it's the first time you printed in black and white, but I believe, this, I believe, marks a pivotal point in your practice. The framing, I mean, you have to see the frames in person, the contrast with the black and white photographs, and then taking it up a notch and turning the room into a full body installation.
yeah, those ovals are about 6 feet on the long side to give you a sense of scale, and those circles are probably 4 feet in diameter. So they have some weight when you walk into the space. The figures seem a little larger than life size.
Yeah.
And the black and white was me sort of tapping back into Wally's, the Jazz Cafe, and the work that I was doing there. That work is still on the wall at Wally's. And I graduated in 2001. And I was feeling a need to reconnect to that part of my artistic practice. I was really nervous too about the black and white because everybody had come to know my work as these colored silhouettes. And so I thought, oh God, it's a major exhibition. I'm going left on everyone, but I like the way that it turned out.
I, as a curator, I will offer my professional
Okay.
and say that, when you were saying, you know, in the fine art world, there's this idea, you should avoid personal subjects, you should avoid landscape, you should. This to me is you took what would be simple, right? You photograph behind a sheet, something, and this is the finest level of execution, I believe. Like this, you were already a fine artist, but this was, I believe, will mark, when we look back, the official entrance into cementing in the fine art world. Okay. Yes. No, and I think it's a great example for the outsider initiative and the groups here that are thinking through ways of executing artistic projects that are deep in rigorous research, that are deep in your personal histories, but that can also be executed at the level we as people. Letitia is making mid-level work, right? In a living room, and it's ending up in a museum. And I think that is something we're told that cannot be done. And this is a great example of it is being done and it is happening.